Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation.
Okay, hello everyone to this Friday's learning session. My name is Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I have been a senior Power Platform developer for the past 4 years, coming up to 5, and I currently work for a company called Vantage 365. I normally hold these Friday learning sessions to basically assist everybody in learning. And this week's topic is less about the kind of technical specification of how we use Power Platform. It's more about how we set our solutions up for success so that we do a bit of work at the start so that we have an easier job later on down the line when we come to deployment and kind of stakeholder buy-in. So this one is going to be a bit more of a talking session, but personally, I find this topic really, really important. As I've gone through my kind of time as being a Power Platform dev, I've learned more and more that a little bit more time spent at the very start can really make a difference later on. So, with that being said, this week's topic is that setting solutions up for success. We do have quite a packed agenda. So we're going to be obviously going through the introduction. That's where we are now. Hi. But one of the first things I want to cover is why that initial setup matters. This is one thing that when I first started, I didn't really understand why we might be spending so much time at the front end and why we should in most cases. So identifying why how a project is set up matters is kind of a key learning point here. We're also going to look at what a successful project looks like, what metrics we might use to measure that success, or what key performance indicators we might identify that can help us measure that. And then we're going to go into some of the kind of must-haves for setting a project up for success. So these are our big headline items. So for those of you who have watched me work before or have talked to me before, you'll know that I am very big on requirements gathering. Requirements gathering be the foundation for setting up a successful kind of solution development. So we're going to look into kind of how we might do that that requirements gathering, how we set our project up so that we've got the right requirements, and we know that we're not going to hit any kind of unidentified kind of scope creep. The next one down is a naming convention. So we are going to cover essentially why naming convention is important and actually how it can significantly contribute to a solutions development, developed solutions success. Okay, because while we do think a lot of the time of naming conventions as primarily of benefit to a developer, there is some benefit that they provide to a client and kind of future success of the project. And I'm really keen on kind of following a solid naming convention. So we'll look at why that helps us, how that might help us set a project up for success if we have a naming convention in place. We're then going to look at project process. Now, this is something that we may have a project manager deal with in terms of when we're dealing with Power Platform projects if we work in the consultancy space. But this is something that's important regardless of whether you're working in the consultancy space or not. Understanding and repeating the same process that works for projects can make it so that you ensure you're following the same standards, ensure that you're delivering a project in the right way. So I see that as a kind of must-have, as a kind of standardized project process. And then we're going to go into some of the nice-to-haves as well. So we're going to look at reusable design patterns, how those might contribute to a project success, and how they could really empower you to kind of deliver that product. We're going to look at learning from experience records, so how we record things, how we learn from our projects, because you may not just do one project. You may be delivering 5 different projects, and it may be that later on down the line, the lessons learned from that can be useful. And then we're going to look at solution-aware governance practices. So this is kind of some of the more application lifecycle management aspects of things, and a few other bits that really do quite heavily contribute to a project's success. And we'll understand why those are in the nice to haves a bit later. And then, as usual, we'll have our discussion section at the end where everyone is welcome to ask questions, and we're welcome to have an open discussion. Pre-warning to this, the items that we have on here are not an exhaustive list of how a project might be set up for success, but these are the key things that through time and kind of experience we've kind of picked up and identified that can really be driving factors in a solution success. But before we get into why the setup matters, we do have our usual rules of engagement. I only have one rule for these sessions, and that is if you have a question, please do ask it. I am a firm believer, and there is no such thing as a stupid question. I really do ask you to challenge that assumption, because the thing is, we're all here to learn. We're all here to try and get the best we can out of this. So if you've got the question, ask it. And I can guarantee you, if you've got the question, someone else is probably going to think it as well. So with that being said, we are going to launch right in to why setup matters. So like I said, before we actually get into the how of setting up a project for success, how we set up our solutions for success, let's talk about the why this matters. Now, you can see a key point in there is building fast isn't building best. One of the things that we'll kind of identify as we go through this session today is that some of this will cause a slowdown in the initial stages of your project, but there is a payoff for that. And we'll start to talk about that. So setting up your solution, your project, the right way from the start makes all the difference. I like to think of it in a very specific way. A solution built without any kind of structure or kind of design around it is like a house built with foundations. It might stand for a little bit, but the moment change hits or you start to add additions to the home, it's going to come falling down. Setups in terms of our solutions aren't about wading through red tape. We are primarily, as Power Platform developers, we're looking for efficient ways to deal with problems, right? That's what we're here for. So we don't want to make that setup too laborious, but there is an element of making sure we do it right, and we don't want this to be wading through red tape. Where it's not about wading through red tape, it is about being ready. This is in such a way that we're ready for other devs to work on the project, for instance, ready for any change requests that might come from the customer or the stakeholders, ready for handovers. You might have to hand over a project midway because of higher priority projects. It does happen, and we need to make sure that our projects are set up in such a way that they're robust enough to manage that change. And most of all, they're ready to deliver something that the business can actually work with and will use. So I have a good example of one of my projects, my first ever projects, that suffered from a poor setup and ended up having to be completely restructured halfway through. So one of the very first projects I ever did, and this was actually as a citizen developer, was a mandatory training tracker application. And it was going great, absolutely brilliant. But what I hadn't done was one of the things we're actually going to discuss is proper requirements gathering. I hadn't gotten all the stakeholders in because I thought, from my history and my background, I knew what the mandatory training was. I'd be able to log it. That was a mistake. If I'd set up my project correctly, I wouldn't have ended up in the state I did, where I was halfway through the project and it was identified that actually there's some new quizzes that are mandatory, and we have to refactor the application to add those quizzes in. So from a point of kind of project setup, why it matters, a lot of this is about avoiding those kind of situations whereby we end up having to restructure things or change things halfway through, right? That speaks to the joys of technical debt, right? Something built well from the start isn't going to lead to a significant amount of technical debt, and it means that when we pass it on or when we have to come back to it later, we're avoiding that point. And obviously I've mentioned about the preparing for change piece. So that's why the setup matters. But what does success actually look like? This is a key part of this. We all know that we should be doing kind of, to some degree, requirements gathering, and we should be following some naming convention. But we talk about successful projects, and a lot of the time the metrics that are used to define it is, hey, did it meet all the requirements? And sometimes it is not just that. So we have a few kind of key points in there. It's really important for us to define what success for our solutions looks like before you even start building. One of the key questions I always ask before I even look at it is, how will I know when this solution is deployed that it is successful? It's not just about delivering on time or it not having any bugs. It's about whether it's actually usable, maintainable, and actually delivering value to the people who are going to use it. So when I talk about delivering value, it's is it making their lives easier? That's a really good question to ask yourself. If you're building something, you go, is this making these end users' lives easier? then you're potentially delivering a successful project if the answer to that is yes. However, there are some more common success criteria I see when delivering projects, and these fall within these bullet points. So does it meet the user requirements we've gathered? So well-defined user needs. We're going to get into that when we look at user requirements. So if it's one of the success criteria, it meets the user requirements. Great. The second one, is it easy to maintain and extend if the business needs change? We all know that as businesses evolve, their processes and their needs change. One of the brilliant things about Power Platform is that we have the capability to change things on the fly and quite quickly. So we need to be able to design a solution and build a solution so that it can make those changes and it can be flexible and it can be maintained easily. So we talk about obviously maintainability and extendability. Does it provide business value? So does it save time or reduce manual effort, or does it decrease the error rate in terms of data entry? Great, that's measurable business value. That's something we should define at the start. And perhaps most importantly, do people actually use the tool? Because one of the things we find quite often, you can build a technically brilliant solution, right? But if the stakeholders and the end users weren't bought into it and they're not using it, it could solve every user requirement that you've gathered. But if the end users don't want to use it, that's still a kind of failed solution. So, given that, we're actually going to move on to the first kind of must-have, and this is requirements gathering. Requirements gathering is essential if you want your solution to be successful. You can't know whether the solution you're developing meets the needs if you don't know what those needs are. And I've put something I got told there at the very start of me developing. If you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you've arrived? This is that requirements gathering piece to a T. Requirements gathering is all about mapping what the user's kind of pain points are, what difficulties they're having, and how your solution might deal with those, right? So that requirements gathering can be done in multiple ways. It might be that you're building a solution for a process that you alone do, and you're intimately familiar with it, right? You're still going to do requirements gathering in that section. You're going to ask yourself questions like, hey, what part of this process annoys me? What parts do I get frustrated with? What parts do I, want to be able to automate or don't want to do again? That is essentially requirements gathering. Now, when you get to developing solutions and you come to developing them for other people, those questions are still very, very valid. When we come to requirements gathering, it's really important to sit down with all individuals involved in the process that you are kind of dealing with and the process that you are going to move and deal with in this solution. But not only that, you need to record what those requirements are. So in terms of actually recording those requirements, one of the quite common things I tend to do in terms of running user story workshops is to ask those questions about what the pain points are, but also ask the people involved to identify what their user role is. So this is essentially what function they carry out in the process. So for example, someone might be a leave request approver. I'm going to use an example. I then ask essentially what their requirement is. Now that's defined by the pain points question, or what they find difficult, or what they need the system to be able to do. So when we look at the requirement, this is what they need to be able to do in that process. For instance, in the case of a leave request approver, I need to be able to review leave requests and approve them. That's a requirement. They need to put that in. And then priority. So priorities is one that quite commonly gets missed out, and there's a reason for this. I personally use Moscow prioritization. Now, what Moscow prioritization is must have, should have, could have, and won't have. But there are other forms of prioritization, like just high, medium, low. But why does priority matter? It helps manage expectations, both for you as a developer, but also for stakeholders involved. So if they've written out, for instance, a requirement for let's use the leave request approver person. They've written out the requirement and they've said, oh, I want to be able to see I don't know, a summary of every single leave request that I've approved from here until the 1st of January 1900, and they just put that as a low priority. Well, actually, that's something that we can look at later, and we can deprioritize that. And when it comes to planning our work, or it comes to delivering the solution, it could be something that we kind of look at later, or it could be something that, hey, actually, we don't need that anymore. There's something else, so we can trim that off. So that priority is really, really helpful. There are other benefits too in terms of capturing your user requirements, in terms of writing them down, making it clear, and in some cases, having the users that you've involved sign off on those requirements. The big one from my side is it helps prevent scope creep. If everybody involved with the project, including the devs, the project manager, maybe the product owner, and all the user roles and all the people involved with the process have all signed off on those user requirements, we can use that as a document to say, hey, we said these are the requirements at that date. We need to have a change request put in. We've got a defined set of requirements. They can go through the change process and we can evaluate it. A lot of the time, that's going to help prevent scope creep quite aggressively. And one of the biggest killers of kind of early projects is that scope creep piece, where you end up in I liken it to the never-ending project. It just keeps on going and nothing ever gets delivered. It sits in dev and test because things keep being added to that. But there is another benefit. Writing those requirements down, having someone present and having the users involved in that requirements gathering, and having them talk about what they don't like about the current process, or what pain points they find, helps them feel like they're being part of the solution. They're building that solution with you. That keeps them bought into the solution at an early stage. So at this point, you're gaining user buy-in before you've even started building something, because they're helping to shape it. And the other thing is, starting off your projects with a proper requirements gathering really sets the tone for kind of a professional delivery process. Okay, I cannot stress enough. Requirements gathering, I personally, I put it as the very first thing in my action plan to delivering a project. We identify what needs to be done. Now, if you hold requirements gathering, what's the outcome? Well, I've seen it. High user adoption. If you get everybody in the room, even the people who maybe don't want to be there, they're actually useful too, and say, what's the problems, what are you experiencing, they feel heard. They feel like they're building part of it. They feel like they're coming along the journey with you. You end up with high user adoption. The other outcome, fewer surprises, both during development and at the go live. So when you do this requirements gathering, you are at that point saying to people, hey, we're going to deal with some of these requirements. We're going to identify something. And ultimately, if you've identified all the requirements and you've done it well, there's better business value there. You're going to deal with more business problems if you've done proper requirements gathering at the start of your project than if you had never done it, because you've actually identified what needs to be dealt with. So that's requirements gathering. How you do it is down to you, but make sure you do it, I think, is the key message here. It is the foundation of an effective solution. Now, on the next one, environment strategy. Quite commonly, environment strategy is one of the things that people think about in their projects too late, mainly because a lot of the time when you go to build a solution, the tenant admins or someone else has already set up environments for you potentially, or there are some level of constraints. However, it's actually one of the first things you should plan. When it comes to environment strategy, we look at the maintainability of tools. This is a key driver for maintainability. I have been in situations where I've had to build a solution in a single environment, and that has been the dev, test, and production environment. From a maintainability perspective, an upgradability perspective, and an extendability perspective, That's not tenable, because when you end up having to improve the tool, you're likely going to break things while you're trying to improve it. So, from my side, I've put this up as a thought piece. It's something you should think about, and I tend to, at a minimum, look at getting 3 environments if I can. This is dev, test, and production. That way you can safely build things in and test them in dev and test without risking business disruption to the live application that's currently in the production environment. This setup helps with things like version control as well, isolation of experimental features in terms of if you want to mess around with adding a new module onto an existing solution, and safe user testing. If you just had a dev and a production environment, and you need to test a new feature, hey, they're testing that in production. Let's see if it breaks the data that's there. Alongside that, if you're setting up your environment strategy right and you're using application lifecycle management tools like Power Platform Pipelines or Azure DevOps that we discussed in the last session, this environment strategy becomes even more important because you can then automate that flow of movement through those environments and set up testing at that point. Now, putting it in here as setting a project up for success, this is less about the delivery of the initial product. It's more about the maintainability of the product going forward. And we talked about that kind of resilience in terms of change. Business requirements always change. If you build something in production, that business requirement changes, you're risking a kind of business disruption as you update for that change. And I will hold my hands up and I'll say I've been guilty of building in a single environment, but it's not best practice, and actually it can lead to problems down the line and lead to an unsuccessful project. So that's environment strategy. Naming conventions. Anybody that's worked with me will know I am a stickler for naming conventions. It's one of the first things I do on a code review in kind of current roles. And it might seem like a small thing, but naming conventions are a huge help as your project or your solution scales and moves into support. Personally, I have written naming conventions for solutions, applications, the controls inside of applications, the variables inside of applications, flow names, flow triggers, environment variables, everything. If there's an object that sits within Power Platform, I've probably got a naming convention for it. Pretty much anything that will be identified by a name should have a naming convention assigned. This should be a format that all individuals on the team or who may be working on the solution or project can agree on. And it needs to be written down. This is so that it's recognized, and so that just by looking at the name, you get an idea of what the object is trying to do, what it's trying to represent. For instance, a good example of this is a recent kind of bit of work. We went through a large application and we renamed all the variables to a very specific naming convention. Now, that naming convention identified whether the variable was a context variable or a global variable. Now, by looking at that naming convention, I can identify whether it's a context variable that's only available on that screen or whether it's a global variable just by the first 3 letters of that variable name. Makes things a lot easier from a maintainability and dev perspective. Having a clear naming convention has significant benefits from that developer point of view. It improves searchability, makes onboarding easier for new team members, and helps with deployment comparisons when working with unpacked solutions in source control, for instance, in Azure DevOps. Digging through source control, if you don't have a naming convention, can be exceptionally difficult. So, for instance, if I'm looking for a very specific control type within my source control, let's say I'm looking for a combo box, with my naming convention, all I have to do is search in CMB, which stands for combo box as a prefix, and I know I'm going to find all the combo boxes within my source control. Without that, I wouldn't have that capability. I'd have to search for some combination of properties unique to that combo box to find the one I want. So again, naming conventions can really play a huge part in terms of maintainability. We're, again, building that resilience for change. This is something we'll keep coming back to in terms of a successful project. because in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, when things change, you may not be there. Someone needs to be able to come in and understand how that's been built and what does what. And that naming convention being there as part of the documentation can be really, really powerful. So, project process. Now, I mentioned at the start that this can sometimes be the realm of a project manager, but it's something we as kind of platform developers should also consider. Having a consistent project process keeps your project moving. I'm not talking about just agile or waterfall approaches. I mean specifically defining how things get done. That includes things such as change control. So, how are changes to the project approved? Hey, we went through our requirements gathering 6 months ago and it said this, but actually now we're 6 months later, the business has changed slightly. We need to make a change to that kind of those requirements. How do you define how the client does that? How do you find what the acceptance criteria are for that? Make sure you plan that at the very start of your project. It's going to happen at some point. It may not happen on every project. You might get lucky, but it will happen at some point, and being prepared for it is better than scrambling. Issue tracking. How do we capture bugs and feedback? Now this is a big one. When we look at how we do kind of dev test production cycles, we have that test phase there for a reason. It's so that we can pick up any bugs and issues before we go to production. But are we clear on how a user might report those bugs? Do they send them to us via email? Do they submit them via a Microsoft form? Do they just pop it in a Teams channel? Do they log it in a planner? Being clear on where those issues are going to arrive, what format they're going to arrive in, and being clear and consistent with the client as well around what information you need from them to be able to diagnose and chase down that bug can make your testing cycles a lot shorter. So while setting this up in terms of at the outset of a project can take a little bit of time, it can save you a lot of time later when you come to chasing down those bugs and logging them. Deployment. We all talk about deployment. We talk about obviously deploying to production, but have we defined how we're deploying? Are we using solutions? Are we instead using Azure DevOps to do automated deployment or pipelines maybe? Being clear on that is useful. There have been situations, and I have fallen victim to it once, where I was planned to do a deployment, and unfortunately, I got in a motorbike accident. We hadn't written down what the deployment kind of instructions were, and then whoever had to pick it up did it in their way. However, what I'd forgot to mention is we had added an unmanaged layer, and so part of the deployment instructions would have been go in, remove the unmanaged layer, and then do this. So actually defining what those deployment instructions are can save that happening, right? It's again about that resiliency for the project. Version control. This is a big one. Even if you don't use Git, track what changed and why. So if you are making changes and updates to a solution, track why and log it against a requirement. If there's a requirement defined for it, we can log it against that. Hey, we changed this part of the app because of this and this. That makes things a lot easier. And I'm going to add an addition to this. We talked kind of last session about application lifecycle management and the basics of exporting managed and unmanaged solutions. You move managed solutions into test and prod. Bit of advice. If you ever need to roll back the functionality, keep the old folders, keep the old zip folders, keep them somewhere, because that's your version control there. You could say, hey, we did this on this date. Even if you drop it in a SharePoint document library with a bit of metadata against it, that's still version control. Just make sure you keep track of what you've changed and why, because it could be, and 6 months down the line, we come back and we look at, hey, why was this changed? Because it now doesn't support this part of the app. Well, actually, we've tracked what changed. We tracked why it changed. We understand the design decision. We can now undo it without with the understanding that it may not impact something else, or it might impact something else. And project stage documentation as the final one for project process. This one is a big one. Defining what artifacts and documentation should be produced at each stage of the project. Now, I talked about Agile versus Waterfall, and obviously Agile follows a principle of dev, test, prod, release, and so on and so forth. But there is a bit that happens before that agile cycle, which is essentially the production of a minimum viable product or the first thing you deploy, right? Now, that will be stage gated to some degree. So understanding what documentation you need, let's say you're in the design phase of that initial sprint. Hey, what do we need at the end of the design phase? Should we have an empty relationship diagram? Should we have high level designs? Everybody within the team having a clear understanding of that documentation and when it should be produced makes it very clear in terms of, hey, we're at this stage, we've got the entity relationship diagram, but we don't have the high level designs. What does the project process say? Oh, well, it says we don't need the high level designs right now. That's next stage. Great. Okay. It means that everybody's working off the same page. We understand what should be there, and also means that during handover, you know what documentation you're getting if you have to take a project on. So that is the must-haves in terms of some of the basics of delivering kind of an effective solution and project. We're now going to move on to the nice-to-haves, and there's a slightly controversial one on here called solution-aware governance practice, which I said at the start, which we'll get to at the end. So as I said, up until now, we've talked about must-haves, the things that, if you don't get them right, can derail the whole project. If you don't do requirements gathering correctly, you're going to end up with random requirements popping up here and there. That means you have to refactor how your project's designed. But what I want to move on now are the nice-to-haves. Now, these aren't mandatory to get your solution out the door, but they do take your delivery from good to great. These are things that help you scale and produce your solutions in a quicker manner. These are the things that make future you or the next person picking up your app breathe a sigh of relief when they realize that they're there. So I always say that these are the bits that add polish. They're quality of life improvements, repeatable patterns, the lessons you've learned the hard way that make every project smoother than the last. So this is experience, right? And we've got one on there for learning from experience. So we're going to look first at reusable design patterns. So this is one of my favorite nice-to-haves. When you create reusable components like standard headers, modals, or flow patterns, you make your solutions more consistent and quicker to build. It also improves user experience because they see familiar layouts and actions across apps that you've produced for them. Okay? And that's going to drive that user buy-in as well. And over time, you can end up even building a pattern library or toolkit that others inside of your business or other developers can use in their projects too. So now we're adding that consistency there and we're speeding up development because we're reusing what's already been built. Now, learning from experience recording. Every single project teaches you something, whether that project went really, really well or really, really badly. However, if you don't record those learnings, you'll make the same mistakes again in the future. Personally, I recommend keeping a lessons learned list in SharePoint. That's my preferred method. And tag them to specific components or situations so that they're searchable later. That learning from experience library ends up leaving you in a state where, you know, you get that little inkling in the back of your head when you're on a project and you go, I'm sure I dealt with something like this before. Great. You can go back to that learning from experience library. You can pick that up and you can look at it. We all, to some degree, probably do this. We all have favorites tabs in in our browsers that point us back to really useful kind of guides. But that change of knowledge that we have when we have a project experience, from what is termed tacit knowledge, which is your experience, into explicit knowledge, which is knowledge that is written down, really does make a difference. Your memory at some point will potentially fail you. So note it down, make it searchable. Alongside that, if you're doing that inside of a business, it helps create a learning culture and makes each new solution that you and your team develop better than the last one because we've got those lessons learned. Now, solution-aware governance practices. This is where the technical and compliance worlds meet. Governance as a whole isn't just about locking things down. I've talked about this before. It's about enabling growth to occur in a safe manner. It's like putting the barriers in a sand pit for a toddler to play in. You know that the barriers are there. You know that they're hopefully not going to get sand everywhere and that they're safe. However, it's here in the nice to haves because technically you should already have solution aware governance practices in place before you create any solutions in your environments. It's here in the nice to haves on the project setup because it should already be there beforehand. However, before we start building, there are a few areas it's worth checking are present prior to commencing any kind of build or design. For instance, data loss prevention policies. Now, for those who don't know, data loss prevention policies are something you can set up to block specific connectors within an environment. If you check the data loss prevention policies, you might identify during the course of the design phase that, hey, one of the things that you had decided you were going to use in terms of connector is actually blocked. That's now a constraint on your project that you need to work around. So it's worthwhile checking those first. The other thing, is usage tracking in the admin center turned on? Now, there is obviously the new admin center, which shows usage tracking, which is exceptionally useful. But is it turned on? Because that might help us define and track some of our success criteria that we defined at the very start of the project. It's useful to have there. And then permissions and security roles currently existing in your environment. So if this is an environment that's already being built in, already produced, are there any permissions and security roles that may have an impact upon your solution in your design build? These are some of the things I check from a solution-aware governance practices piece that can change how you might design your project or how successful your project might be, or even tracking some of that success criteria. But it's worthwhile noting, if you bring governance in from day one, you avoid, I think someone termed it once, the dreaded Power Platform Wild West. And who knows, like I said, you may even identify a project constraint when you check things. But that is the nice to haves.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.